What does it mean to be called crazy in a crazy world? Listen to Madness Radio, Voices and Visions from Outside Mental Health. Sponsored by the Icarus Project and Portland Hearing Voices, Madness Radio can be heard on KBOO-FM, the Pacifica Network, and online at madnessradio.net. Welcome to Madness Radio. This is your host, Will Hall. Today my guest is Khatera Aslami-Tamplen. Khatera is a psychiatric survivor. She's the Consumer Empowerment Manager for Alameda County Behavioral Health Services in the Bay Area, California, and the governor's appointee to the California Mental Health Oversight Commission. She's also the county manager for the consumer-run Pool of Consumer Champions in Alameda County. So welcome to Madness Radio, Khatera Aslami-Tamplen.
Thank you, Will. It's a pleasure to be on the show with you.
It's great to have you, and I'm really interested in talking about this whole question of how we do effective advocacy at the state and county levels. You're somebody who's come out of the movement and the background in the nonprofit world, and now you're both in the grassroots movement organizing world and also in the advocacy and county politics and state politics world. So I'm really interested in talking with you about that, especially in the context of the recent battle that Alameda County has been waging over forced treatment, independent outpatient commitment, and we're going to be talking about that a bit later. But why don't we just get started? Tell us about your own process of involvement in the mental health system, how you got involved with these issues, and your own personal story around mental health.
I experienced a mental health system that was quick to diagnose me, medicate, and attempt to manage me. And that was later on in my early 20s that happened. But my story really starts also with my early childhood and my family, because I was born in Afghanistan. My family fled during the Soviet invasion of our country when I was 2 years old. And we experienced a lot of trauma trying to escape. We didn't immediately come to America. We had a process, but by the time I was 3, America granted us political asylum. I know right now, currently in our country, there's a lot of debate about refugees and Muslims. And I want to just speak to not only saved our lives, but I've been very fortunate to be able to give back to our community and support others. And so, having fled a war-torn country, my mother and father had serious medical and psychological problems. And early on, I became the primary interpreter for my parents, particularly for my mother and her psychiatric services, in addition to other healthcare appointments and needs. Starting, as a young girl growing up, it was a lot of pressure. I definitely am an advocate about, not creating that kind of situation for young kids to have to interpret for their parents. But early on, I started seeing injustices, how people treated my parents because they couldn't speak English. There's a level of trust that has to be developed, especially when you're talking about mental health issues. And, within a small community, the community that I grew up in, Fremont, had the largest population of Afghans outside of Afghanistan. However, we did not want our problems to get out into the community, because even though everybody really escaped and experienced trauma, there was a lot of shame and self-stigma around that. So it fell upon me to be in the role of interpreter and share with the psychiatrist what was going on. And he really started off providing my mother and I with family therapy. And he was attuned to the fact that there was a definite disbalance of power, and putting a kid in this kind of power position of interpreting has a lot of stress.
What were you, like 8 years old or 7 years old or something?
Yeah, I was. And, because our services depended on it, my parents really worried a lot, and that was passed on to me. But it also showed me how to address issues when they came up. For example, it also showed me how to not give up. Didn't understand things. I had to find a way to get better information.
What kind of services are we talking about that you guys were dependent on?
Well, the welfare system, we were on Section 8 housing.
You really came as war refugees with almost nothing in terms of resources yourselves, sounds like.
Yeah, my father was retired in Afghanistan. My mother, when she got here, she tried to go back to work, but she had her hands trembled, and she couldn't. She wanted to go into cosmetology, and that didn't pan out because of her physical health conditions and her psychological condition.
And you said that you saw a lot of injustices in this whole process of interpreting and then also coming to the United States and getting services from the system.
Yeah, there was one story that stands out very vividly for me where my mother was needed an eye exam to get correct glasses, and she had both the far and near glasses. And during the exam, the assistant did not know she had two glasses and asked her to, take the eye exam. And after the first one, my mom said, "This is very difficult for me. Should I wear my other glasses?" And the woman yelled at her in front of me. And I remember having to say, "I'm sorry, but that was not the appropriate thing to do, to yell at my mother for not knowing what you were expecting from her." And having to say, "Can I speak to someone else that can address this kind of unprofessional behavior?" And this was like, at that time, I was 10 years old.
You spoke up about that as it was happening at age 10. That's remarkable. There's many of us who could never speak up about something like that as it was happening as adults. We would just be in too scared or in shock.
I think what helped was it was my mother. It was easier to speak up for my mother than in my life, sometimes harder to speak up for myself. So, yeah, I think the takeaway point was I had to figure out a way early on to make sure our voice was heard, or else it would be, detrimental to our livelihood. So I was in survival mode when I was speaking up, and had mindful enough to know that I had to be able to manage the situation and my emotions, which weren't always easy. And that's, over time I learned that if I can just make it simpler, like, okay, I need to talk to someone else, because if I keep talking to the person, it's going to build up my frustration and I will be less effective. So I just had to keep repeating, like, "Can I speak to someone else, please?" And try to resolve situations with the proper process.
So that's really remarkable. So from a very early age, you were brought into a family and a situation as a war refugee that really made you into an advocate and an activist from the very beginning. And so what happened? And then at some point, you yourself started to get involved in the mental health system, and you yourself started to have problems, or
Yes, I did have it throughout my teenage years. I struggled with depression, long periods of sadness, anxiety, and I also, was in an arranged marriage, and I did get out of it eventually. But what happened is I lost my support system, my cultural, my community. It's a taboo to get a divorce in our culture, and I felt excluded from within my community, especially my immediate family, and misunderstood. So I went through several years of living a secret life after my divorce, where I, had my own place. No one in my family knew it was. I ended up in another bad relationship, and I was working in the mental health system as a recreational therapist, which, working within a subacute locked facility, I also, saw injustices that, as growing up, it was hard for me to sit back and be like, "That's okay."
and when the marriage, when you decided that you wanted to get out of this arranged marriage and go against your family and the community and the culture, how old were you then?
It was between 22 and 23.
And you ended up working in the mental health system just as a recreational therapist. Was that just because you were interested in that kind of job, or did you become a counselor at that point, or how is it that you decided to do that?
I got an opportunity at Cal State East Bay, back then Cal State Hayward, to work within the recreation department. And from that, the dean of the department recruited me into the field. And I loved it. And one of the internships was at the psychiatric subacute center. And so I did an excellent job. I really focused on what I was good at was connecting with people. So they saw that I was able to relate. And I mean, I didn't come in with clinical language and I didn't know the diagnoses. I just knew this is another person that's struggling and I want to hear their story. And I find it a privilege to hear their story. And I wasn't at a place where I could share anything about what my challenges were, but I was always aware how it made a difference when someone listened. And so I just took that role and I built relationships with and trust with the consumers that were receiving services at the center. And before I got my recreational therapy degree, a position came up and they had asked me to apply for it.
And when you started working in that new position, that's when you also started to see these abuses that were happening, and that just really added to the stress and struggle that you were going through at the time.
Exactly. It definitely made things much more difficult for me. And after a couple years of being the recreational therapist, I got moved up into the director position. And so it was during that transition where I was also transitioning out of going through my divorce. Here I was being moved up, and really, I want to stress that I feel like I was given the opportunity because I connect with the clients, because I could build a relationship with them and help them. That's so valuable, in no matter what position we're in. And I was lucky enough that the agency valued that and gave me an opportunity to be the director.
And so, in addition to all these really difficult challenges you're facing in your personal life, you're doing this work and then you're really believing and connecting with the people that you're working with, but then you're also seeing the other side of the system, the abusive side, the hurtful side. What were some of the things that you saw that concerned you so much?
One of the examples that stood out, one of the events that stood out for me was a young lady. She was playing loud music in her room, and it was her wellness tool. She was dancing to it, she was enjoying it, but it was bothering the staff, and they wanted her to turn it off. She wanted to play it. So their approach was, five large men. They all wore gloves and they were walking towards her room with a shot and a pill. And I knew what that was going to, basically what that meant was that they were going to give her a choice between getting a shot or taking a pill and going to what they call the quiet room. At that point, I was a rehab director, so I was able to approach the head nurse, and say, "Hey, can you give me a minute? Let me talk to the young lady and let me see if we can avoid either a shot or a pill. There might be a different solution." And I know he wasn't very happy with me, but he had to agree with my attempt to try to keep a bad situation from getting worse. So I had walked in and she was already kind of curled at the corner of her bed on the floor. And I mean, they had already asked her probably several times to turn off her music. It was off by then, and at this point, they still wanted to medicate her. So I had already a relationship with her. I went by her bed and I sat down and I said, hey, what can we do to really try to minimize the situation even further? And what do you want? And she said, I want to keep my stereo with me, and I'll be willing to walk in the other room if that's where they want me to be, but I don't want them to take my stereo away. And I said, okay, that sounds reasonable. Can I walk with you and can we sit and continue to talk? And she said that would be very helpful. And so with the five large mental health workers and nurse standing by her door. We both walked past them. I said, we're going to the other room. We'll continue talking, but I think it's okay for her to keep her stereo. And she won't play it, but she wants it with her. And it gave her a sense of like, this is important to me. And it allowed her to voice what she wanted in this situation without it getting worse. For me, I thought everyone should be able to do that. Keep a situation from getting worse.
Because what you're describing really is not some kind of medical intervention or psychotherapy technique that's helping her to recover or to regain emotional wellness. What you're describing is a situation of control, that it's virtually the same scenario that one might find in a prison, that the inmate is being told that they have to comply with the rules, and there's a threat, essentially of violence, if they don't comply.
Exactly.
It sounds like seeing that and seeing other examples of that really showed you that the mental health system really needed some fundamental changes.
Yes, it was a very top-down approach, and our system relies on that top-down approach. And one other thing that I think is really detrimental in our system is when we assume or we come with this belief that the person lacks insight, like they don't know, and we dismiss them immediately just because they have a diagnosis that they don't understand the situation. They can't think for themselves, or and then we take this authoritative approach when the fact is, if we actually do listen, the person will come up with a solution. But it comes down to, do we want to listen, and how much do we value the solution that that person shares with us? So I find it very difficult with that involuntary outpatient commitment laws, is that they go in there saying this person lacks insight and therefore they need someone else to make decisions for them, when the reality is the criteria to even get into involuntary outpatient commitment, you are not gravely ill or disabled. So that is the danger, is that we're promoting this value or this belief that people lack insight, and we're making this judgment out of fear prior to anything ever happening to the person, and taking their rights away because of that fear we have.
Yeah, that's really the essence of violence, is you're denying the other person their own voice and you control them. You violate. Violence is a violation of their capacity, their humanity, the integrity of their body, and the respect for their mind and their own thinking, their own preferences. And so so you were in a situation where all these things had happened with your family. You're coming out of a marriage, and then you went into another difficult, abusive relationship, and all these stresses are kind of building. And now you're in this job where you're seeing these very hard things to see and witness, and the system hurting people. And it's really building up the stress. And it sounds like at some point that threw you yourself into the system.
It did. And I went in to see a psychiatrist. I I have to back up a little bit. When I was interpreting for my mother, the psychiatrist spent an hour with us. He really gave like therapy, and it was beneficial. So when there are times where, you know, people do a good job, and then there are times, majority of the time, unfortunately, people are psychiatrists have a short amount of time, and they want to just kind of give you the prescription. And so when I went in to seek my own mental health services, I went to a psychiatrist. I thought I would have that hour, and I was just a mess. I was crying. I wanted someone to listen, and he gave me literally 5 minutes. He cut me off in the process and said, "Here's your diagnosis. You have, major depression, anxiety disorder, and here's your, medication. Come back in 2 weeks." And that was it. That was like, he said, "I have to get to my next appointment." And
Oh,
I
wow.
was stunned. And then, to make the situation worse, the medication I had an allergic reaction to, and actually was medically hospitalized for the reaction. And from that, I really had to figure out how medication would even work for me. And
What was the medication? What was the allergic reaction that you had?
well, I got lockjaw, and I immediately stopped seeing the psychiatrist and stopped taking that medication. This was my early 20s, and I now looking back, at that time I was not in the movement, right? So like it took me several years afterwards to get into the movement, into our recovery, mental health recovery movement. And so I just wanted nothing to do with that process. And so I still have to go back, and part of my story is to go back and find out what medication caused that allergic reaction, but I didn't write it down. I was lucky to just survive that experience. And
Because I mean, it's one word, lockjaw, but that's terrifying. When your body seizes up like that, people do have muscle reactions to medications like that, and it's terrifying. You think that you're going to be seriously injured or damaged, or you'll never be able to stop it. You don't know what's going on. That must have been very, very frightening to have that happen to you.
it was very frightening, and I reached out to someone within the mental health field that I was working with, and she came in the morning and took me to the emergency room, and I was very lucky for that support. But it was a horrific experience, and I definitely became extremely aware at that time that I don't want to depend on medication. I have to know what I'm going to take before I take it. So and of course I changed psychiatrists.
So in that moment, your own advocacy nature, which showed itself very early in your life, came right online and really helped you to get what you needed to change the medication and have a different attitude towards medications and realize the risk that you were facing.
Yeah, afterwards it did.
If you're just tuning in, this is Madness Radio, and our guest today is Khatera Aslami-Tamplen. She's a psychiatric survivor and the Consumer Empowerment Manager for Alameda County Behavioral Health Services in the Bay Area, California. She's the governor's appointee to the California Mental Health Oversight Commission and county manager for the consumer-run Pool of Consumer Champions. And then what happened next?
I became more interested in other approaches to addressing my mental health issues. Again, like I said, I was still in that very unhealthy relationship, and that heightened my awareness of like I don't have the support from the relationship I'm in. So I became very determined to free myself from that in a way that was safe. And then I got more involved with Wellness Recovery Action Plan. I started attending a support group because I knew, I had an experience, and I was starting to look for others that were out in the community where I could speak freely and hear and gather support from. And so that's when I started becoming aware of the Alameda County Pool of Consumer Champions, the consumer-run organizations in Alameda County. I got introduced to Jay Mahler, a pioneer in our recovery movement. I really became more interested in what are the other approaches to helping me achieve my wellness and my recovery.
So you first went to the psychiatrist and had a bad experience, and then fortunately the recovery movement, the patient survivor consumer movement, was there in Alameda County available, and then you got connected with that. Is that how you ended up eventually working as an organizer with the consumer survivor movement?
Yeah, I became involved in a consumer-run organization, and at one point, after several years of being involved with them, volunteering with them on their board, I was asked to apply for when their executive director position became available. And it was at a time where I said, I really want to be in the community versus in an inpatient hospital setting, and I really want to help others connect to the community resources. And so it was a perfect timing. I got hired into it, the executive director position of the consumer run organization, and got more involved with the Pool of Consumer Champions also, which at that by 2007 was just starting and was growing in popularity.
So why is this work important to you? I mean, why is it that you have become so involved, and what do you think is the value of having these consumer-run organizations?
Well, I think it's so important for those who have experienced the mental health system to be able to, if they want to, work in the field to be able to give back to others. And I think it's critical that we have individuals that are in those positions that say, I've been there, I've done that, and recovery is possible. I think it promotes hope. It gives people, when they're, struggling, a different perspective. They think differently when they know that someone else has been there, has done it, and is right there supporting them through their process. I think those roles are critical for our mental health system and for our communities to heal and to get better. I think hope is critical, and mental health has so much stigma to it. So when someone gets diagnosed and they don't know that there is recovery, that there is hope, it does become not only an internal struggle, but it affects everything in their lives, their relationships, their jobs, their education, their social life. I think my involvement with our recovery, our consumer survivor movement, has been constantly learning new things about experiences that are typically really misrepresented in the mass media. I think a lot of I started learning about the spiritual awakening for people, and I know you've talked about this. That psychosis, can be perceived also as a spiritual awakening for people because they're really connecting and looking internally more and finding ways to find meaning in their lives. I didn't go through psychosis, but I've been through, again, deep periods of depression, extreme anxiety and panic attacks. And then later on in life, I was diagnosed with bipolar. I don't identify with the diagnosis, but I can see where the recovery movement helped me find a little more meaning to what I was experiencing so that I could get through it and find a way to be able to then connect with others that are going through it also.
You said before that a lot of this for you is about social justice and community organizing. How has that been important for you personally, and how do you see that in the organizations and the movement that you're a part of?
Well, this is a social justice movement because I think we, in the mental health system, those that have been trying to transform the mental health system, those of us that have experienced the mental health services and the mental health system, we see how in this day and age, it's the easy scapegoat. Anything that happens in the community that people don't understand, they want to find something to blame, and the finger is all, it seems like more and more pointing at, oh, they were not diagnosed. Oh, the mental health system failed them. And I wish the answer was that easy. It's not. And it's becoming more and more the easy scapegoat. So we're misunderstood. And when we try to speak, not enough of our communities are hearing that perspective of, there are actually effective other solutions to helping people recover. And also the fact that when something bad happens, the problem isn't that they weren't diagnosed or that the mental health system failed them. There are many other things in society that are causing some of the horrible things that we're seeing that has nothing to do with the mental health system and a diagnosis. And so I feel that we have a lot of work to do to help communities look for better solutions than trying to force people into treatments and medications and dependency on a system that actually causes more problems in the long run, more trauma in the long run.
So do you see this the scapegoating as driving a lot of the interest in involuntary commitment and the pursuit of policies like recently we've seen Alameda County adopt with involuntary commitment?
I do see it as contributing greatly to that. I also see, I mean, not only the scapegoating, finding an easy, target to blame, but also the fear and that being falsely exacerbated in the media. So people are in a place where they're not thinking rationally, they're responding out of emotions. And that emotion is fear. And basing policies on fear is very dangerous. It really, we want in Alameda County, and I know nationally, we agree. We want more services, but we want the services that will help people. And there are a lot of us that know exactly what we need to help people better. Unfortunately, we have to fight against the forces that are perpetrating the fear and creating policies that will further push people away from wanting to seek mental health services voluntarily.
So to take a kind of a devil's advocate point of view, I mean, I can imagine there are people in Alameda County or people on the board of supervisors who are saying, look, we've got people on the streets who are living out under freeway overpasses, who are in the bushes behind government buildings, who are living rough. They seem obviously mentally ill or obviously crazy or something. And these people need help. And we are seeing them go into our prison system, which is terrible. We don't want them in our prison system. And we don't know what to do with them. And we think that just grabbing them and putting them into the hospital is the most humane thing to do, because clearly if we can just get them on medications, then they'll realize that they have options other than sleeping out under the freeway overpass, that they have options other than getting involved with the police and ending up going to prison, that they can slowly start to get their lives back. But we've got to just take them physically and put them in hospitals, get them evaluated, and force them to go on medications, because ultimately it's in their best interest to get them back in touch with reality. What would you say to that devil's advocate?
I would say before we would take that kind of approach, why wouldn't we try to give that person a peer specialist that checks in with them, that builds a relationship with them, and that maybe starts to just give them their basic needs? The hospital is not the long-term solution. Housing is the long-term solution. So there are ways where we can engage people and start providing for their basic needs that they may not be getting out on the streets, but that they would be willing to accept. I understand that there is within this involuntary outpatient commitment stuff, just the court process is about like $20,000 to $30,000 per person. And I can't help but think like, okay, offer them the support, offer them the like voluntary services. But how about instead of the court process, say if you accept these voluntary services that are like, gonna give you someone you can connect with, that you could talk to, that will bring, a blanket or food for you here and there. And then how about offer them, instead of that court process, a safe place to live in?
So you're saying that just the decision that the system makes to put somebody through the legal process, the court process, not paying for the hospitalization, not paying for the psychiatrist or the doctor or the nurses or anything like that, just the legal paperwork costs $20,000 per person around the involuntary outpatient commitment?
Yes.
That could easily be spent so much more productively in terms of housing or in terms of a counselor to meet with the person. I mean, that just seems very, very backwards. But then the devil's advocate position would say, look, that's a nice idea. You go and meet them, you offer them housing, but it's not going to work. Where's the evidence that says that these peer specialists or meeting people who are homeless is actually gonna help them. What we know is that if you put them in hospitals and get them on medications, that will calm them down and that will get them back to reality. Why is all this other stuff? Why do you say this is going to work?
Well, what I do know is that so there is the hospital system, right? Like when someone is gravely ill and you hear the horrible stories about what they're doing and that they really need someone to take action. So we have these hospitals we send people to. But I think what you're talking about also is there is a push for the in the community involuntary outpatient commitment thing as being the solution to minimizing the hospital use. And what I found out is
Right.
that's not true.
Once we get them evaluated and then we decide this is their diagnosis, now they're out in the community and we've got to force them to stay on the medications in the community. That's the outpatient commitment piece that
And,
we're going to continue to have them monitored and under court control in
and that
their wherever there is their housing or wherever it is that they're receiving these medications, whether they like it or not.
So you hear, oh, we need outpatient services to help those individuals that lack insight and don't want and are refusing treatment. And if you look into how they qualify someone for outpatient services, most of the time screen out the people that are very resistant to services. So our current system that says, okay, when you're gravely disabled, we'll, intervene, and when you're a danger to self or others, we'll intervene then and we'll, put you in a place that's a hospital and take your rights away. The people that are ending up in involuntary outpatient commitments programs would have accepted the services without the court process.
So again, we're seeing the emphasis is on a control and like a public safety and almost like a penal system approach of using force and deploying control on people rather than having a more voluntary and preventive approach, which would save
Yes.
might put resources at the beginning of the process, but then you save money in the long term. And let's talk about that a little bit about the role of money in this. This is all explained in terms of, well, this is the best interests of patients and their families, but you've also suggested that there's a lot of people who stand to make a lot of money from involuntary outpatient commitment and the use of force. How does that come in as a factor here?
Well, I think there are providers that will see this approach as the easier approach. And if they were to get a contract to provide the services, they'll make money off of the power over the top-down approach in the community. Really, what it is it's the easier approach for the provider. I don't have to work harder to engage you, to try to build trust, to try to bring you to our services. I could just use this threat that if you don't comply, I have this court order, could take you back to the judge or take you back to the psychiatric emergency room because you didn't listen to what I was telling you to do. And if you don't have to spend time in building a relationship and building trust and providing services that is person-centered, then you're making a profit from services that in the end really doesn't help the person. It creates a consistent customer and a court-ordered customer.
So it's a huge dehumanization of the whole process, that the relationship building piece just gets dropped out of it, and it's about treating people for illnesses without really connecting with people as people.
Correct.
So Khatera, tell us a bit about your work locally and statewide. You came through the community organizations as someone who was really needing help and needing services as an alternative to psychiatry, and then you went on to be working more on the political level in the county and state context. Tell us about your work around that.
Well, my work locally in Alameda County is with the county behavioral health care system, and I bring the recovery vision to the leadership there. And I also bring the voice of the consumer survivors in the community that I work with to the leadership table. So when policies and decisions are made, not only is the community informed, but then the policies are informed by what the community feels and is appropriate and is not. And we work with the consumer-run organizations in our county and the efforts to really further bringing people together, bringing consumers, survivors, clients, ex-patients together, identifying problems, looking for solutions, and really finding ways to outreach, educate, and get people involved in transforming the mental health system. So that's what the Pool of Consumer Champions we do. It's got 1,015 members, mental health survivors who have joined, went through an orientation to be part of the Pool of Consumer Champions, who have committed to the recovery values. And we engaged them basically through committees, through conferences, through education and training seminars, so many things that we do throughout the year to really get people, and we employ them to run it. So it's really ran by the people. My staff and myself are actually considered as staff support. It's just rich with the involvement of the people that it serves. So that is one of the ways where I fulfill my job in making sure the voices of the people that are served within the mental health system are elevated and have an opportunity to impact our system. And so then outside of the Pool of Consumer Champions, like I said, there's consumer-run organizations. I think it's really valuable. It's critical. Every community supports the leadership and the employment of people with lived experience within the mental health system. So we work collaboratively and we're very involved in our community, and we're involved in the state level. So part of my work at the state level on the Mental Health Oversight and Accountability Commission is I sit in the seat of someone who's experienced the mental health system, and to be able to make sure that our state oversight of our county services and what the voters of California voted for, which was Proposition 63, the Mental Health Services Act, is aligned with the recovery vision that is about engaging the users of mental health services and their families, and making sure that our system is accountable and helping people recover.
So the Mental Health Services Act was a specific fund that was established by the state, and it was intended to go into mental health innovations. Is that right?
Community mental health services and innovations is one of the components. Yeah, there's several components within the Mental Health Services Act. Innovations is one, prevention and early intervention is another, community services and supports, technology and improving our ability to provide and gather data is another area. And then the last but not least is workforce education and training. And so these components were written within the Mental Health Services Act, which is a really transformative law that was passed, again, by the voters of California. And the legislators can't take that away from us unless the voters of California say they don't want it anymore. And hopefully, we've seen so much positive change in our community. We have a lot more to do throughout our state, but the Mental Health Services Act brings a lot of resources throughout California.
Has it been really applied in the direction that it needs to be applied to, or has it been a lot of the same traditional services that haven't really worked for people? Are they the ones that are tending to get the money?
Well, I believe that it has applied in the way we want to see it. I believe we have opportunities to help improve it, continue to make an impact, but it has increased funding for programs that are led by family members, that are led by consumers, survivors, that are focused on recovery. And there's, a lot of effort to be able to really make sure that we're moving California in a direction that's showing that people are getting well and experiencing recovery.
Khatera, we are just about out of time. If people want to find out more about your work, more about the pool of consumer champions and the involuntary outpatient commitment struggle in Alameda County and around the country, and they want to get in touch with you, how should they follow up with that?
They can definitely visit us at www.pocc.org. My email is KA, S as in Sam, LA, M as in Mary, I at acbhcs.org. And that really stands for Alameda County Behavioral Health Care Services.org. So people can email me, and you can find me on Facebook. It's Khatera Aslami-Tamplen. I'm easily accessible, and we'll be happy to provide any kind of support for anybody that or answer any questions that people have.
Khatera Aslami-Tamplen, thank you so much for joining us today on Madness Radio.
Thank you, Will. It's a pleasure.
You've been listening to an interview with Khatera Aslami-Tamplen. She's a psychiatric survivor and consumer empowerment manager for Alameda County Behavioral Health Services in the Bay Area, California. She's the governor appointee to the California Mental Health Oversight Commission and the county manager for the pool of consumer champions. That's all the time we have on Madness Radio. Thanks for tuning in. You've been listening to Madness Radio, Voices and Visions from Outside Mental Health. Madness Radio is sponsored by the Icarus Project and Portland Hearing Voices. Host is Will Hall and producer is Nina Packabush. Madness Radio can be heard on KBOO-FM and the Pacifica Network, and shows are archived online at madnessradio.net.